Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take time to thank you for joining us today. A few quick notes before we start. In your presentation view, you will see a Q&A dialog box where you can send questions that may come up during the presentation. You can send in questions at any time during the presentation. All questions related to this presentation will be answered. We will attempt to answer questions during the presentation, but we may not be able to get all of them during the presentation. We will, however, answer all questions. So if you do submit a question, please hang around as we may answer this question verbally during the presentation Q&A portion. Or we will answer your question via the Q&A dialog box. You can also submit questions and comments through Twitter. Hashtag is DTLKTechTuesday. Or by email. The address is info@datalink.com. Again, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. So let's get started. Protecting VMware using NetBackup. With the introduction of VMware, IT changed dramatically. Gone are the days where standing up a new server meant buying your additional hardware. Now we can create a new virtual machine in record times. How do you protect those new servers? You could install the NetBackup client on each virtual machine and create a new policy to back up those clients. But there's an easier way. Symantec NetBackup can back up your virtual machines in a simple, efficient manner. So how does it work? NetBackup can back up virtual machines using the vCenter API written by VMware. The API handles all operations and is the interface between NetBackup and VMware. In most cases, the NetBackup client does not need to be installed on each individual VM. That saves a lot of time right there, just being able to point NetBackup at your vCenter, not have to push agent out to hundreds or even, in some cases, thousands of virtual machines. Application backup requires Symantec's VSS providers to be installed on the VM, which will, for the application level backup, require that the agent is installed on there. Some considerations when planning out your implementation. Snapshots, you must be able to snap a VM to back it up. So the VM, you must be able to go into vCenter and actually snap the VM in order for NetBackup to be able to back up a virtual machine. Typically, the majority of the I/O that you're going to create, it's going to take a bit, but it's going to be during your snapshots. That's when you're going to see the high I/Os. And the majority of it happens during the removal of the snapshot. Snapping of a database server is not considered reliable. This can lead to corrupt databases as well as inconsistent or unrecoverable restores. When you have a database, you're dealing with transactions that are put into transaction logs and then read into databases, and these are happening very quickly. So just a traditional snap of a VM machine may or may not be consistent for restore. For files, for the most part, it's fine, but when you're snapping a database, there's a potential to introduce inconsistencies and could lead to you not being able to recover that individual database. So that's something that you'll want to be aware of. This is a limitation of VMware, not NetBackup, since VMware is going to be the one doing the snapshot. A restore will complete successfully, but the database may not be consistent, and Symantec does not support that. So when you go to put back or restore a virtual machine, your virtual machine will restore and more than likely will boot up, but the database itself may or may not be consistent. So that's something to be aware of. Snapping a virtual master server can lead to very strange behavior. I've seen in the past where customers will have a virtual master server and they'll make that part of their backup rotation. And a lot of times that will cause some inconsistencies in the image database. It'll also cause NetBackup to pause while that snapshot is happening or the snapshot is removed. And again, with the majority of I/O happening during the removal of the snapshot, that server becomes very busy, and so jobs that are running will more than likely fail, and you'll see strange behaviors such as error code 2505 and 636s. it's not a good practice to snap any NetBackup servers, and that will apply to media servers that may be running MSDP or disk-based storage that are virtualized. It's not a good idea to back up any of those master or media servers that are part of your NetBackup environment. Restoring a NetBackup media server from a snapshot would lead to an inconsistent NetBackup domain. How this can affect you is if you have a virtual master and a virtual media server, when you go to back those up, if you were backing them up, you would back up you would set it in your policy. When the policy kicks off, it's going to back up your master server. And then after it completes the master server, it's then going to back up your media server. There'll be two different time frames. The time that the master server is running, that snapshot occurs first. So that's your frozen point in time. And then you back up all the data. Then you release the snapshot. And then you would pick up and snap the media server and back that up. But in that elapsed time, whatever has been going on in NetBackup, such as media allocations, duplications, things like that, can be lost. So it's, again, not a good idea to back those up using VMware. Load balancing across your VM data stores and ESX hosts it's a critical component to preventing an issue with VMware, such as introducing latency, hosts that are slowed down significantly where VMs are not able to serve data, or the network is congested and your production environment suffers due to lack of bandwidth or lack of processing power. So that's something that you would want to test before you implement in production, and make sure that you're balancing the load, not only in your backups, but if you place a master and media server, that those are balanced and you've tested to make sure that you're not impacting VMware during the actual backups. Configuring NetBackup. So how do we set this up in NetBackup? To configure NetBackup to back up VMware, you first have to tell NetBackup about your vCenter server or ESXi server. So NetBackup has the ability to connect to vCenter, which makes it able to back up your VMs without actually knowing about each individual ESX server. In larger vCenter deployments, you would have a single vCenter server, and you might have 10 or 12 ESX hosts, each one hosting VMs. And so you do not need to define them in NetBackup. You simply tell NetBackup about the vCenter server, and NetBackup can gain access to each of the ESX servers by talking to vCenter. And again, everything goes through the API, so NetBackup is just going to reach out to vCenter for the information it needs. So in the NetBackup admin console, you'll perform the following steps. Expand credentials along the left and select virtual machine servers. Right-click and choose New. Enter the vCenter or ESX host name. Select the virtual machine server type. For a virtual center server, if you're using that, you'll select virtual center server. If you have a standalone ESX or ESXi server, you can select that server and put in the local credentials, and that's if you do not want to leverage vCenter for your backups. And then you have this third option, which is a restore ESX server. In some instances, it's beneficial to restore to an individual ESX server versus going through vCenter if you're having issues with vCenter, the database not being consistent, or various other errors in vCenter. You can actually redirect your restore to an individual ESX server, and this is where you would define it. And so you'll enter the credentials to be used. The next step is to go to Host Properties, bring up the properties for your master server. Select VMware Access Hosts, and you'll add in any servers that you want to use as a host to handle the backup. This does not have to be a NetBackup media server. There are benefits to using a media server as your backup host. If you're doing fiber-based SAN backups, the ideal situation is that your tape drives are on the fabric and your media server becomes the backup host, which has the ability to attach to VMware. So you'll want to make sure that your zoning is correct so that the media server, which is your backup host, has access to not only the tape drives but to the VMware data stores. and effectively you're moving your data across the fabric and not across your network, which has significant benefits for your production network not being impacted. So the backup processes, what steps happen, and how does a backup run through the data path? What is the data path? The backup process flow. So NetBackup will start the job at its scheduled time. NetBackup will create a parent job, and a sub-job for each VM will be started to take the snapshot. Another sub-job will be created for the actual backup of each individual VM. The job steps: identify machines, either using VIP or VMware Intelligent selection, or manually selecting your VM. So when a policy kicks off, it's going to identify, do I have a select list of clients that were manually selected, or do I have a query that I have to execute to determine what is going to be backed up? Once it has the list of VMs to be backed up, it will then proceed to create snapshots, determine the data movement type, whether it's going to be SAN, NBD, hot-add, or NBD SSL for secure sockets. Then it will start the process of backing up the VMs. Once the VMs have been backed up, and this is on a per VM basis, once the VM is finished, the sub-job that took the snapshot will then issue the commands to remove the snapshot, and then the job will finish. Snapshot processing. So again, NetBackup does not talk directly to the ESX hosts unless defined, and it does not attach directly to the data stores. It relies on that API to handle the communication to vCenter or the ESX server to get things done. It's a much more efficient method. So NetBackup requests a snapshot by reaching out to vCenter via the API. And you can actually pull up the VMware vCenter console and see the snapshots coming in. And you'll see the first screenshot here, create a virtual machine snapshot. It'll have your virtual machine and it'll show the status. And below that you can see in progress. So you can actually monitor the snapshot as it's happening. It's the equivalent of right-clicking on a VM in vCenter and choosing Snapshot, Take Snapshot. So this is a great way to troubleshoot if you're having issues with a VM backup. If a snapshot in vCenter fails, NetBackup is going to fail the job. It's not going to be able to back up that virtual machine. And you can monitor that again in your tasks in vCenter. You'll see that the status will show failed, it'll show some form of an error, and NetBackup is just going to get that error and understand that the snapshot was not created, so the job will fail with a status code 156. If you cannot go into vCenter and snap a VM, NetBackup can't do it either. NetBackup tells vCenter to take a snap of this VM and give the snap this name. And during a backup, after the snapshot has been taken and the data is being backed up, you can actually pull up this snapshot and take a look at the naming convention used. It's a very unique naming convention. And you'll see it'll be labeled NBU_snapshot_C time, which is a unique value in seconds that prevents a duplicate snapshot from happening, prevents that type of error message. Once the snapshot is complete, vCenter tells NetBackup about the snapshot via the API. So vCenter will relay back, okay, you asked me to take a snapshot. I've taken that snapshot. Here's all the information about the snapshot for your backup. So you can view the snapshot, as I mentioned earlier, by right-clicking on the VM in the vSphere client, and you'll notice that it has NBU_snapshot, the host name, and then the C time. Once the backup is complete, NetBackup will tell VMware to remove the snapshot, and again, you'll see in the tasks, remove snapshot, the client, and the status. Advanced snapshot options that you have available. You may need to tune how NetBackup handles snapshots to achieve certain criteria. For example, virtual machine quiesce. What this is going to do is before it takes a snapshot through the API, NetBackup is going to tell the vCenter server to go ahead and just hold off on disk writes for a short amount of time. And it's a very insignificant amount of time, but what this does is this allows that all files are written out and that the data is consistent. The machine is essentially paused for a split second to allow a consistent snapshot. You have the option to include all disks. You can ignore diskless VMs, and you can choose whether or not you want vCenter to see all events. By default, vCenter will have all events posted. You'll have the virtual machine quiesce enabled. The option for include all disks will be enabled, and ignore diskless VMs is disabled. Typically, these values don't get altered from default. There are reasons why they might be, but by default, having them on, it typically will work in 99% of scenarios. And again, there are times where you may need to do that, and typically those include having an active database on the server or a server that simply cannot pause for the required amount of time for a clean snapshot to happen. And those are things that should be looked at to make sure that if you are turning this option off, what is the impact? You need to be fully aware that you might not be getting a consistent snapshot. So now we'll move on to transport methods, and this is how data is going to be moved between the data stores and your storage units. So as I mentioned earlier, we have SAN. This is the most popular method for doing this. You'll utilize your SAN for data movement. This will require that the backup host has a fiber card in it and is attached to the SAN, and it also requires that it is zoned to have admin access to the data store. So you want to make sure it's in the same zone and that it has a read and write capability to that zone. Hot add method, mount the virtual disk to the backup host. This is not typically used as much anymore, but it is still around and it still works. This requires a virtual media server for each data store that is going to be backed up. So if you have 4 data stores and you have virtual machines that you're going to be backing up and you're going to use the hot add method, you have to have 4 virtual machines, 1 in each data store that is allowed to mount the disks within the data store. So essentially what it does is it will take a snapshot and then mount that snapshot to the hot add machine for backup. The second most common method is NBD. So this is going to utilize your network for data movement. It's commonly used if your backup host doesn't have a fiber card. It's a great test to identify SAN issues. If you have backups that are failing for SAN method, switching to NBD, if the NBD works, then you need to investigate your zones and your permissions within those zones to make sure that your backup host has the access to them. This is used during restores to address known issues. One of the issues that has been common is that during a restore of a virtual machine, the restore will complete with a status code of 0, and the data appears in the data store. Everything looks good, but the VM will not boot and displays the error message, OS not found. And this is a limitation in SAN technologies that sometimes the virtual machine does not get the appropriate boot sector written, or there are sometimes issues with the data store and the block size and various other issues. If you experience issues with a restore and you see this type of error message, the best recommendation is to switch to NBD and test the restore. If that works, then you would need to investigate your SAN zoning and your SAN permissions to make sure that everything is working there. And there's some logs that I'll get into that you can look into those logs to determine what the core issue is. The last method I'd like to talk about is NBD SSL. So this utilizes network and encrypts the data for data movement. This is used if you require encrypted data transport. It is slower than NBD. Although you're going across the network, you have the additional step of encrypting the data for transport. This setting is on a per policy basis. So during your policy configuration, you'll have the option. You'll see 4 checkboxes. Best practice for this is if you are not going to use hot add or NBD SSL or NBD, is to uncheck these options and put the options you do want in order of importance at the top. So if you would like to have SAN as your first choice and then NBD as your second choice, you would make sure they were both checked, and then you would highlight NBD and move it up to below SAN. And again, this is per policy basis. So VMware policy configuration. In NetBackup 7.5, there's a VMware policy type. Two types of client selection are supported: manually browse and select the VMs. This does not dynamically add new virtual machines as they're created, and if you go to add a new virtual machine that is not there, you'll need to refresh your cache to make sure that it shows up. This method bypasses the VMware throttles, which I will cover further in this presentation. The other method is VIP, VMware Intelligent Policy. This dynamically adds newly created VMs based on selection criteria, allows VMware throttling of jobs per data store, number of simultaneous snapshots, and jobs per host. So what this will do is when you select this method, you will develop a query to determine what VMs that you want to back up in a particular policy. And I'll cover that in an upcoming slide. Policy configuration for VIP policy. On the Clients tab, choose Select Automatically Through Query. You have the option to use the basic query tool and select your criteria. You also have an advanced mode to further refine your selection criteria. If you are using advanced mode, clear the query to switch back to basic mode. And the reason for this is that options that you may select in advance may not show up in basic mode, but may actually be there. And one key point here is to always use the test query button. This will execute the query and provide you a list of VMs that were either included or excluded based on your selection criteria. So let's move on to application level backup. In NetBackup 7.5, you can perform application level backups, and at this point it's currently limited to Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint recoveries. This will allow you to restore individual items that normally would require agent-level backups from a VM-based backup. So as the VM is being backed up, if it is an Exchange server and you have this option turned on, NetBackup will see that it's an Exchange server and will, as it's streaming the data, separate out the Exchange data to allow you to recover individual databases or recover individual mail items, all from a single VM backup. It's not going to connect and back up the VM twice. It's simply just going to pull out the Exchange data for you and index it, which will allow you to restore it. And it does the same thing for SQL as well as SharePoint. This will require the semantic VSS providers installed on the virtual machine, which will require the client to be installed. And this is to allow advanced snapshotting. Semantic VSS provides the tool. It is by default on your master server, and it is only needed for application level backups. You do not need this for, say, a VM backup of Linux or just a Windows file server. This does not provide any functionality for you other than Exchange, SQL, and SharePoint. And so for your file level backups or Linux VMs, you don't even need to install the client. You just simply point it to VMware and you're off and running. Some considerations. Why should you use VIP policies? Well, one of the most common things that I've seen is a VM getting created either for development or a development machine that was created and was not backed up because it was development and then moved into production, and it never gets put into a policy. There's a lot of manual overhead of making sure that everybody is communicating what needs to be backed up and what doesn't on a continuing basis. So VIP-based policy eliminates that for you. A manual selection of clients only gets the clients in the list, whereas a VIP policy will allow you to set parameters to query. You can query based on data store, based on ESX host. You can query based on annotations. So it provides a very high level of configuration, and you can include or exclude VMs on a large number of criteria. Why should you use manual selections? Well, when you're using a VIP-based policy, if you're testing, if you want to determine what is the impact of me backing up this VM, does the VM become unresponsive on the network? Is there a significant impact when doing this? During testing, a VIP policy, you cannot target an individual client within that policy since it's a query. So you might want to add that into a manually selected policy where you define that specific client to see what the impact is. How should you choose your backup host? Two methods are supported. Backup media server. This is the media server that's writing the data to storage, is also going to act as your backup host. So this is an efficient method for if you're using Fabric, you don't even need to transition your network. You're simply going to have the backup host attached to the data store, attached to your storage, and move the data. Specific host. You can use any Windows-based client that has the Windows client installed on it, the NetBackup client, to the latest patch. And this is defined in the host properties of the master server. Use one specific host for all VMs to be backed up. Your backup host manages the snapshots and data movement. So this backup host will be the one that is going to manage the snapshot for you. It's going to reach out to vCenter and handle that. The host must be a Windows server with a NetBackup client installed. For SAN-based transport, the host must have a fiber card so that you can use the SAN transport method. So why would you select vCenter instead of selecting your ESX hosts individually? vCenter offers intelligent resource management across ESX hosts to provide load balancing. So if you have VMs and you have VMs that are on a specific ESX host and that host is starting to run short on processor or memory utilization, you can configure your VMware to automatically determine, I have an ESX host that's under a heavy load right now, and I have another one over here that's not doing a whole lot, and so it will automatically migrate hosts over. So it's going to intelligently manage your resources. So you have that benefit of having that load balancing and not having to worry about defining your ESX hosts, and then when you're doing your client selection, if you have your ESX host and not vCenter and you browse to select a virtual machine, NetBackup will make a correlation that if I'm going to back up this virtual machine, it exists on this ESX host. If you manually migrate that to another host, the NetBackup job will fail. It's not going to know that you did that migration. So VMware tracks all VMs that are running on what hosts and what data stores. So as things get moved around, vCenter is fully aware of that. When you're using vCenter in NetBackup, you don't need to worry about where is the VM, what data store is it on, because NetBackup's going to handle that for you. VMware also provides you the failover of VMs, which goes along the same lines of your host migrating. You can either manually or automatically do that, but either way, using vCenter will allow you to go ahead and have those VMs be tracked by vCenter and provide that information to NetBackup. So let's move on to the restore options. So during a restore of a VM, if you have a VM that's crashed or you need to restore to an earlier point in time one of your VMs, you have two options. You have the option to restore the entire VM, and you can change the disk provisioning type. You can switch it from a thick provision to a thin provisioned. The disk size is not changed, but the entire disk is not allocated. Disk allocation is the size of the data to be restored. A word of caution on that is this can lead to overcommitting data stores, and I think this is something that VMware admins are well aware of, but I do want to point that out for those who haven't worked with VMware before, if you have a data store that is, for example, 1 terabyte, and you restore 5 VMs that are 300 gigs apiece, that is going to require 1.8 terabyte. Using thin provisioning, if those VMs are not fully utilizing all of that space and you restore them, it will allow you to restore. But what will end up happening is as your VMs acquire more data being put in there, you will eventually use all of the data store space, and your VMs in that data store will no longer be able to function. So that's something to be aware of when restoring VMs and the impact of thin provisioning. You also have the option to restore a single file from a VM backup. When you back up your VMs, the data is smartly analyzed by NetBackup. So it's peering into that stream of data, and it's indexing all the content within there and building a catalog based off of that. So that gives you the ability to leverage the speed of a full VM backup while also having the flexibility to restore an individual file. This requires a NetBackup agent to be installed on the VM if you wish to put the file back to that same VM, or that you have a location that has the agent installed that you can put the file back to. And it's important to note in this, if the file is of from a Windows VM, you need to have a Windows client with the agent installed to put that file back, and the same for Linux. You cannot restore a Linux file to a Windows machine with the agent on it. You need to stay with like OS there. So let's walk through the restore wizard and see how one of these restores works. So the first option we have is an original location restore. So we're going to put that VM back to where it came from, the same data store, the same host, etc. So you're going to choose the destination, and you'll click Next, and you'll choose the transport method and recovery host. So you'll choose what host you want this to be put back to, and you're going to choose, or the recovery host to use, and you're going to choose the transport method. You'll choose the additional options and run the pre-recovery check. Before you can execute a restore, the final step is you have to run the pre-recovery check. This is going to verify that the data store has enough space to allocate for the VM, verify that the ESX host exists and that the networks exist before you go and do the restore. Common issues with restores that I have seen is if a restore is of a VM, if you had a VM out there that was functioning as your production VM and you wanted to bring it back to an earlier date offline, not serving data, you'll want to take this option for restore BIOS UUID. You'll want to make sure that's unchecked. You do not want to have multiple. You don't want to have multiple VMs with the same UUID. This will cause problems and inconsistencies within vCenter. So you'll want to make sure to uncheck that. If you're putting it back to the original location, you may want to choose the option to overwrite the existing virtual machine if your existing virtual machine is still there. Remove backing information for devices like DV-ROM drives and parallel ports, and you can add those back in on the fly, but this is a good idea to remove those if you're running into issues with your restore. Remove network interfaces, power on the machine. You also have the ability to set a job priority, and you have this option down near the bottom to retain the original hardware version. In the lower half of the screen, this is where you're going to choose the provisioning method you're going to use for your virtual machines. You do not need to use original provisioning. You do have the option of doing thin provisioning, and it is at very little cost. It's not going to cause any additional issues, but it's a nice way to put that VM back to a data store that may be smaller for the purposes of pulling information out of it. And again, you'll always want to run the pre-recovery check. So there are times when you want to put back a VM to maybe look at the state it was in a couple of days ago, or you need to offline, you look at something and you don't want that VM serving data. So here you're going to need to do a redirected restore. So it's very similar to before. You're going to choose the transport mode and the destination. So here you're going to select alternate location, You're going to choose your transport methods, the vCenter server. This gives you the ability to put it back to a different vCenter server if you'd like. You'll also want to select your ESX host, the data store, and folder to put it in. And then you'll have the display name, and this is where you'll want to change it to a different display name so that you're not impacting the current VM. And various other options here for your data store cluster and such, and you can change those. You're going to choose your additional options, destination, and networks. So here's where the wizard will vary a little bit more from the original location. Again, we have these same options here, and when doing a redirect or restore, you'll always want to make sure to remove, to not restore the UUID. That is going to cause you some issues if you do. And you can choose to leave the original provisioning, or you can alter the provisioning method. When you click Next here, you're going to have a new part of the wizard. And this allows you to actually select different data stores to put your virtual machines back. And if you have multiple disks within a VM, you'll see multiple options. You can redirect one VMDK to one data store and another to a different data store, all accessible by the same ESX host, of course. And then you can choose what networks you'd like to have the VM be able to connect to. So you can change from the original, or you can just select the original. By default, I believe it selects the original. And again, you'll run your pre-recovery check to make sure that your data store has space and that everything is able to communicate successfully. So now we move on to the troubleshooting. To start off with NetBackup restores and backups, there are several logs that come into play, some legacy and some are the more of the VX logging method. For a restore, the tar log will handle the actual writing of the virtual machine to the data store. So that's a log you want to look at for restore failures. BPBKAR handles the data movement for backup. This is a log you'll want to look at for backups. When you're looking at troubleshooting an issue, if your snapshot fails, you won't get a log for BPBKAR because it hasn't even gotten to the data movement. This is only a log that provides logging for data movement. BPFIS handles the processing of the snapshot. So BPFIS is called, and it handles the structuring of the command that will go to vCenter for the snapshot and the response that will come back. And then we have the more advanced logs, the VXMS logs and VMAPI logging. So these log the behind-the-scenes talk between NetBackup and VMware through the API. These logs can get extremely large in VMware environments, in large VMware environments. These logs, by default, will sit on the C drive. So if you have space limitations on the C drive, you want to be considering that when determining your log level. And these logs can get, I've seen logs go as large as 100 gigabytes. So this is something that's important consideration when enabling this logging. For larger VM environments, they can get even larger than 100 gigabyte. And then there's VMware logs, and this is within your vCenter environment or your ESX host. NetBackup relies on VMware to be functioning correctly for backups to be successful. Since we're using that API, we're relying on VMware to actually take the snapshot, and we're relying on VMware to provide us accurate information about where the snapshot is, to provide us accurate transport methods, and make sure those are consistent. So it's a useful idea to collect your VMware support bundle for review if you suspect you have VMware issues, and you can do that by going into your vCenter client, go under Administration, and Export System Logs. Individual ESX logs will be exported as well as vCenter logs, so that provides you a useful support bundle to troubleshoot your VMware environment if you suspect you have VMware issues. Common issues that we see. Common status code is 1001. This will only happen on VIP policies. It indicates that two virtual machines with the same name are discovered. This commonly happens for clustered VMs. When a VIP policy runs, it executes a query against VMware asking for a list of machines. VMware will reply with the IPs of the VMs. NetBackup will look up the IPs to find the host name, and if it finds a duplicate, will generate a 1001 error. In the example below, if you have a clustered web server, VMware will report back node 1 with this IP and node 2 with a different IP. When NetBackup performs a lookup on the IPs, it will come back with a clustered name, and that will generate your 1001 error. There are several tech notes that are on this, and you'll see those tech notes here, and they'll be available in the presentation as well when the presentation is mailed out. More common issues, the status code 156. This indicates a snapshot failure. So you'll want to review your BPFIS log on the backup host to determine what the error was, and this is also showing up in your job details. Verify the VM can be snapped within VMware, right-clicking on it and taking a snapshot. If backing up at an application level, verify that the Semantic VSS provider's utility is installed on the VMware client OS, and again, that is also requiring the agent portion. A restored VM will not boot, OS not found error, and this is what I had mentioned earlier. Symptoms, the restore ends in the status code 0, so everything looks good. Files in the data store appear to be the correct size. vCenter shows no issues with the VM, but when you power it on, you run into this error. The resolution for this is to perform the same restore, but choose only the NBD transfer type. The options to look into for SAN restore, correct SAN offline or read-only LUN issues, and there's a tech note attached to this on what you can look for when doing that, some common issues. Restore fails. This can be caused by vCenter issues such as corruption, data store issues, network issues, ESX host issues, or DRS issues. It may be necessary to use a restore ESX server, and this was the option that I pointed out earlier. So when you're going through, you're going to define your new VMware restore ESX server. This will bypass vCenter and restore the VM directly to an ESX host. This bypasses vCenter and any issues that might be in vCenter, and then you can bring it back into vCenter. You may need to add this back into vCenter within the vSphere client manually. VMware policy change times out. NetBackup will query all vCenter servers each time a client is added or the query is changed. In some cases, vCenter may not be accessible by all the NetBackup servers. A common example is a media server and a separate vCenter that are in a DMZ or at a remote site. There is a registry value to control which media servers access which vCenter servers, and this will prevent this error from becoming a problem. And again, we have a link to the tech article that discusses exactly that. More common issues that we have seen, VMs or vCenter not showing in the GUI, or the query variables like annotations are not showing the individual values. This can be caused by outdated VMware cache. These files are stored on the master and in some cases the backup host if the backup host is in a DMZ. On Unix, these files are under by default location of user openv, NetBackup, online_util, fi_cntl, on Linux, Solaris, and Unix. For Windows, that's program files, Veritas, NetBackup, online_util, fi_cntl on Windows. Move the XML files out of this folder. They're recreated the first time VMware is accessed. Either a query is updated or the policy runs. It will automatically recreate these XML files. I recommend that you move the files out of the location and not delete them. For matter of referencing back to when things were done, you may want to put a date on the file or something like that, but it's much easier to track doing that. VMware restore failing with a 2817 or 2820. This can be caused by vCenter not being able to create the VM. as you're issuing restores, you can look in vCenter and see create virtual machine. Every step of what's happening with NetBackup talking to vCenter is traceable in vCenter. So this is a really good troubleshooting. And again, the error will be seen in vCenter. For the virtual machine being configured to use an ISO or CD-ROM drive that is no longer present, that's one common issue. If you have ISO stored on a data store, you installed your OS, you installed SQL, and you had it mounted from an ISO. 6 months goes by and you're cleaning out your data stores, you remove that SQL ISO, the VM is still configured to connect to it. When you go to restore, it's not there. So another common one is a data store no longer present or a VM configuration option no longer valid. The most common fix for this type of issue is to eliminate the, or to check the option for remove backing information. This will remove the CD-ROM information and the VM-specific options that can cause issues. Another option is do not restore the UUID information or hardware version. So if you do not choose to restore the hardware version, when you restore the VM, it will update to the latest hardware version supported by your vCenter and ESX server. The Symantec VSS provider. On a Windows server, this will be located under Program Files, Veritas, NetBackup, Bin, Goodies. And there's also an article that talks about how to install them, any various options that are included, as well as a link to the download. And you'll want to install those on any VMs that you are wanting to be able to do application level backups on. So having completed that presentation, I'll move on to the Q&A here. And so I will go ahead and answer any questions that we have on this. If you've submitted a question, we will go ahead and get those answered. And so I may answer them verbally, or I may respond back individually in the window that you sent your questions in. You may see the response. One question that we have seen: how does HA DRS affect your backups? So in VMware, you have the ability to set up HA and DRS, and this allows your VMware to be more closely monitoring your VMs in case of faults, network link failures, data stores being close to capacity, or ESX hosts that are failing. So one of the common questions that I've seen is, how does this affect NetBackup's ability to back up a VM? Well, when a snapshot is created, a VPX lock is placed to prevent the VM from migrating. So when you're going to back up a VM, one of the first things that happens is NetBackup will, through the API, request that vCenter place a lock on the VM from doing any form of vMotion, and will basically hold that VM in place. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the questions and answers that you've all submitted, and I see quite a list. That's great. Okay. So one of the questions that I see here is, the backup host and the ESX host the same? An ESX host is going to be your individual VM hardware. So you'll have a piece of hardware that you've installed ESX on, and that's where your VMs run. Since that is a Linux OS and it's fairly well locked down and customized for VMware, it cannot be a backup host under any conditions. So another question that I see here, and this is a good question: if your backup is backed up using one transport method, can you restore with another transport method? You can, and there is no limitation on that. It's a matter of connectivity. So if you were to back up using SAN, you can restore using NBD, or vice versa, as long as the connectivity is there. Another good question I see here: can you restore a thick disk to a thin disk to recover unused space? I have seen a lot of customers that will use this as a form of migration to convert a VM from a thick provision disk to a thin provision disk, and it does work. And I have not seen any issues with it. The restores complete successfully, and it does convert it over to a thin provision disk. So this can be done. I wouldn't recommend it as a method to simply make the conversion, but it can be done. Okay, and another question I see here, are NFS presented data stores supported? NFS backups or NFS data stores are supported for backup, but you cannot use the SAN transport method. It has to be NBD-based backup for that to occur. So you can have NFS data stores. NetBackup is not necessarily aware of what type of data store from the standpoint of network attached storage, whether it's NFS mounted stores or locally mounted. I've seen some hosts set up where they have locally mounted underlying in the OS. NetBackup knows that it's network-based, so obviously will not be able to back it up using the SAN method, but it does back up NFS data stores without issue. What permissions does the user account need? So when you're configuring NetBackup to talk to vCenter server, the best rule of thumb is that it needs to be a full administrative account within vCenter, because with a backup, we're requesting snapshots, we're requesting access to data stores, and we're accessing virtual machine information. So we need to make sure that that account is an administrator. As well as for the restores, it needs to be an administrator because it needs to have the ability to create a virtual machine and configure the virtual machine. So the account used for backups within that backup must be a full administrative account. Let's see here. Okay. One of the questions brought up here, for application level backups, does it support full and differentials? Yes, it does support full and differentials. You can use block level incrementals for your backups. So you can do differentials, and you have the option to do block level incremental backups of your VMs. So yes. Support for fiber or iSCSI. So within NetBackup, when NetBackup is talking to vCenter, it does support iSCSI. The backend storage is not terribly important for NetBackup. NetBackup needs to know the difference between a SAN-based storage and other storage, essentially. So what it's going to come down to is if you have the SAN transport method selected and you attempt an iSCSI backup, that backup will not run with the SAN because it's not able to attach through the fiber to the data store to do the backup. But it will work with NBD and is fully supported with NBD transport methods. So if you're using iSCSI storage, you'll want to make sure that you select NBD as your transport method. So when you're configuring your NetBackup policies, and since you do not have to install the NetBackup client, you can have a policy that has a mix of Windows and Linux clients. You can have them in the same policy. Since we're relying on VMware to take the snapshot, we don't necessarily we're not necessarily concerned with the operating system and the differences between them, because NetBackup is going to peer into the data as it's streamed to the backup host and determine the operating system and build that catalog information. So you can mix Linux and Windows clients in the same policy. Additional licensing for NetBackup. So for licensing based on features and not capacity, the licensing you will need is you will need advanced client license, and you will need at least one Windows for any Windows VM, and you only need one Windows client license to cover all your Windows VMs, and one Linux to cover all your Linux VMs. The more popular method, and a lot of customers are migrating over to the capacity-based. For capacity-based, all your features are available, and so licensing really isn't an issue from a feature standpoint. So for your traditional licensing, where you're licensing by feature, you need to have an advanced client license, and then you need to have at least one Windows for if you're backing up any Windows VMs, and one Linux, Unix for your Linux or Unix VMs. A question that just came in: can we restore file level for Linux using VMware backup? I think that's what he's asking, is can you do file level restores from a Linux client backup? Yes, you can do file level restores from a Linux VM backup. And the criteria for that for an individual file level restore is that you must have either the agent installed on the Linux host, if you're going to restore the file back to that Linux host, or a Linux host that can be either physical or another virtual machine that has the agent software on. So when you're doing a file level restore to either Windows or any other OS, it's the same as you are doing a restore in a traditional physical client. There's no difference. You actually have to connect to the client to restore the data. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're going to do a restore to an individual VM, you have to make sure that if it's a single file that you have the agent installed on there. I see a lot of customers that will build a Windows server with Windows client on it, and they'll use that for file level restores of Windows, and then migrate and move the file over manually. There's a question out here: how many VMs limited for data store? From a NetBackup standpoint, NetBackup doesn't care how many VMs are on a data store. It doesn't necessarily track the number of VMs sitting on a data store. Since NetBackup is talking to vCenter, it relies on vCenter to provide it information about if it's manually selected, it's going to tell vCenter, I'm going to back up this virtual machine. Please provide me the information, what ESX host, what's the data store, all the information about the particular VM, and then we'll proceed with doing the backup. So from a NetBackup standpoint, it doesn't matter how many VMs are on a particular data store. The NetBackup doesn't really care about that information. It is something to be considered with VMware throttling. If you limit the number of VMs per data store in your VMware throttling from a standpoint of active jobs at a time, if you have a data store with a large number of VMs, it's going to take a longer time to complete. So that is a consideration, but from the standpoint of the VMware architecture, it doesn't matter. I think I already had covered this one, but this is a question that I see come in here. Does vCenter prevent host migration for systems that are currently in the process of being snapped? So before NetBackup is going to do a backup of a virtual machine, before any of the steps are taken, NetBackup is going to request a lock placed on that VM to prevent it from doing any vMotion, prevent any of the VMware processes from moving the VM to a different host, migrating its data store, any of that information. So that is all going to be locked before the snapshot can be taken and all of that. So. All right. Okay, so I think I've covered most of the larger questions here. I see we still have some questions out here that will be answered on an individual basis. So if you've asked a question and you have not received an answer to that, please hang around and we will answer those questions for you. We'll continue to answer them. You can also send an email to info@datalink.com with questions or comments. And as mentioned earlier, you can also tweet us, #DTLK Tech Tuesday, all is one word. And we look forward to talking with you again. And thank you very much, everyone, for your time. Have a wonderful day.